Just a quick word right here at the beginning. Please do me a favor, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Just say hello. Leave your thoughts. It helps promote this video. It makes the algorithms happy. Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76. Together, we're decoding the deception. We're here back in the book of Genesis, and we're into the account of Joseph. And today we're going to cover today chapters 40 and 41. And I'm going to make the statement I make very frequently. We need to make sure and look at this text apart from all the things we have filed away from Sunday school. Not that that is a bad thing. It is a good thing. And if you have that Bible background from your parents dressing you up in your good clothes and taking you by the hand and marching you to Sunday school every morning, and you have that general outline of the Bible in your minds from that, you should be thankful. The thing we have to make sure and do is not let that take on the scriptures. I call it the Sunday schoolification of Bible stories. We need to move beyond that to really dig in to what we see here. And when we do that in this account with the life of Joseph, with him there in prison and the prisoners telling him his dreams, and then his interaction with Pharaoh again about dreams, there's all kinds of really cool stuff that is here, things that we can pass over and not really think about. So he's been thrown in prison. Where we ended last time was he was there in Potiphar's house. We're going to talk about timeline and how long he was in different places, because we are able to piece that together. But now he's there, he's in prison, and he has been elevated to kind of top guy for the man, the warden, we would call it, the captain of the prison. He's taking care of everything for him. And apparently, when the butler and the baker get thrown into prison, they're put under the care of Joseph. So let's read. And it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. Okay. It came to pass after these things, and in Scripture, it'll just do this, kind of these broad sweeping statements, but we can piece together how long from different time references that are given in the life of Joseph here. We can piece things together. So at this point, more accurately, when Joseph goes before Pharaoh and then becomes the head of all Egypt, he's 30 years old. So we're able to figure out, here, I'll just read this over here. When the time frame is not specified here, later chronological references allow for a reconstruction. 2 years elapse before Pharaoh has the dream that he calls upon Joseph to interpret. That's in chapter 41, verse 1. Joseph is 30 years old, like Jesus when he started his ministry. Keep that in mind. When Pharaoh elevates him to high office. That's chapter 41, verse 46, which immediately follows this successful dream interpretation. As a result, Joseph was probably 28 years old when he entered prison. That means he served Potiphar for roughly 11 years, because we're told that he was 17 years old when his brothers sold him into slavery. So piece all that together. He was in Potiphar's house for 11 years. Now he's going to be in the prison for 2 years. What were you doing 13 years ago? When we talk about these periods of time passing, what were you doing 13 years ago? Stop and think about that. How old were you? What were you doing? Imagine all that time you had been sold into slavery. You were working in Potiphar's house and now in the prison for 2 years. That's a long period of time. And we've got here these titles of the butler and the baker. We have ideas of what that looks like. These were very important positions in a royal household. Okay. The butler took care probably of the entirety of the house, how everything operated. We think of a butler and we think of him walking up with a cup of tea and a plate of crumpets for the master. This was and even in those homes in England, where they have butlers do a whole lot more than what is portrayed on TV, but it's a very important and a very trusted position, as was the position of baker in a culture, especially where bread was so important in all the things they made from bread. How they offended their Lord, we don't know. It calls him the king of Egypt. Now let's talk Pharaoh, and we're going to do this for just a few moments, but it is important. Out on what I like to call the Wild West of the internet, you will find out all kinds of things. All these people, and it's not just on the internet, who are trying to figure out what Pharaoh was which Pharaoh was which when the Exodus happens. Which Pharaoh was it that Joseph served? And I'm going to save you a lot of headache. There is no way to know. There is no way to know. Some people will tell you, oh, because the Exodus was at this time, it was this Pharaoh. That's inaccurate. We don't know the timeline. Trying to go back in time 4,000 years and figure out who was where and when you've got all these different kingdoms. You've got Egypt, you've got the Sumerians, you've got all the other cultures and kings, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. As we move on through time, they all had their own reckoning of time. And we don't have all their records. We think that we've just got everything that Egypt ever wrote down. That's the way things are portrayed. We've got diddly squat next to nothing of what Egypt wrote down and what went down. It's 4,000 years. So it's just a downward spiral into madness to try to figure out which Pharaoh was which. You can't know, and it doesn't matter. Now we're going to go here. At this time, this we do know. At this time, when Joseph was in Egypt, even when the Exodus happens, I do believe the Exodus happened somewhere around 1446, even with knowing that, they didn't even call the Pharaoh at that point in time. They didn't. They didn't begin to assign it as a title, Pharaoh, until about the time of King Saul, King David, King Solomon. So afterwards, after Moses had written this, rather than using the word king, someone who's copying the text would put in Pharaoh because that's what he was known as then. That's not playing fast and loose with interpretation or inspiration of the scriptures or anything like that. We do the same thing. The archaeologists, the historians who study Egypt now, will talk about a king of Egypt from 2500 BC, and guess what they call him? They don't call him the king of Egypt, they call him Pharaoh. Pharaoh. Now, the term Pharaoh was associated with the house of the Egyptian king. The word Pharaoh literally means great house. That's what the word means. So it was associated with the king, but it didn't become a title for the man until about 1000 BC. So Keep that in mind. Don't. And then the other thing that happens out on the wild west of the internet is people want to make it look like this stuff's all made up. They don't really know anything. And that's not true. We know what we need to know. The scriptures make sure that for the record of the working of God in the history of man to bring about his salvation, God makes sure that we have everything that we need to know, and we don't have to doubt that. People who don't believe in the Bible, and that's where most of the information out there comes from. When you hear, and this is important, man, I'm glad I thought of this. When you hear Bible scholar, what you hear and what that designation means, I can assure you, are two vastly different things. You hear Bible scholar, and you think of a theologian who believes in the God of the Bible, a theologian who believes in the inspiration of Scripture, that God's Word, the 66 books of the Bible, are inspired, the inerrant Word of God, and that they approach the Scriptures with that view. And I can assure you that in the majority of instances, that is not the case any more than an Egyptologist believes in the gods Horus and Ra and all of that. This is just simply something that interests them. Many of them, I will say from my experience, the majority of them don't believe it's true. So just because they're saying, Bible scholars say, biblical archaeologists say, it doesn't mean what you think it means. File that away. Make sure and remember that. We'll continue on. Back to the butler and the baker. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came in to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" Now, remember, these guys are probably getting preferential treatment. They're not down there with their legs in the stocks with rats crawling over them next to the guy whose skin is rotting off from some terrible disease. They're in the pokey. They're in trouble with the king, Pharaoh, but they might be elevated again to their position. Kings get mad. Kings can say, throw them in the dungeon. They go in the dungeon. Kings can say, lock them up, get them out of here. Nobody questions it. There was no judicial system as you and I think of it today. What the king said went, and he could be capricious, change his mind, and he's going to about one of them. And that's just what happened. So these guys probably were getting special treatment. They were probably in nicer quarters there in the prison, and that's why Joseph, the captain of the guard's top guy, was taking care of them. And first of all, I think Joseph was a good guy, but he sees that they're down. That's more important to him than saying that the guy who's in there for murder and is down there with his feet in the stocks with rats crawling over him, that he's having a bad day. Joseph probably doesn't give the same level of attention. Let's talk dreams. Let's talk dreams. In the scriptures, it is clear in this context, God speaks through dreams. Doesn't mean he always did it. Remember, those important two words that sound very similar, but start with a different letter. Descriptive and prescriptive. Descriptive tells us what happens. Prescriptive tells us, okay, this is something that you ought to do. This is something that applies, generally speaking, or applies in these circumstances. I'm glad that my dreams have no significance, because if they did, I would think I was insane, because my dreams most of the time are just stupid. I tell my wife about them over coffee in the morning, and we both laugh at me. This is different. Let's talk about why, and this is the most important point, why God used dreams. He did it with Joseph before. Do you remember? And here I have a picture ready to cue up. The dream of the sheaves bowing down to him. Keep in mind, those are sheaves of grain. His brothers bowing down to him, and then the dream of the moon and the stars and the sun bowing down to him. God used dreams in the life of Joseph. God also used dreams in the life of Daniel. Isn't that interesting? The two people about whom the scriptures record, those inspired, inerrant words of God, record nothing negative. God used dreams in their lives. Now, why did God use dreams? We could say, I don't know why God used dreams. He used dreams. That's been the theological interpretation of it I always got, and I disagree. God used dreams because it made it clear he was the one giving the dream, and he was the one giving the interpretation through his servant to elevate his servant. Think Joseph here when he goes before Pharaoh. Think Daniel with King Nebuchadnezzar. The accounts are fairly similar. By using dreams, God elevates his servant from a low position to a high position. He tells them things only he could know. He gives the king dreams only he could give, and that he could give the interpretation to his servant. So the use of dreams, we can see it as an important tool in God's arsenal in interacting with man. And remember, wise King Solomon tells us, I think it's Proverbs 21:1, the king of the heart is in the Lord's hands, and like the rivers of water, he turns it wheresoever he will. God is always in charge. God is always in control. It doesn't look like it here for Joseph. He's in the slammer. He's gone from being sold into slavery, working his way up in Potiphar's house, now being here in prison. Let's talk about the dreams. They said to him, we have each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. He's going to say that repeatedly. God gives the interpretation of the dream. He's not taking credit for it himself. Again, faithfulness and humility. Daniel does the same thing. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were the butler. He's foretelling also what he very much wishes would happen to him. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. This guy was the butler of Pharaoh. He spent time with Pharaoh every single day. Joseph is wise to make this request. This guy could get him out of the slammer. For I indeed was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, and this guy thought, hey, he got a good interpretation to the dream. Mine's fairly similar. I want to see what it means. This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Really bad news. It wasn't Joseph's news. God gave Joseph the ability to interpret these dreams. We're not told that was a skill Joseph always had, but in this instance, it was. God used this. Now, let's talk a little bit about Egyptian religion, their take on things, because if we're not aware of that, then we miss things. Okay? And this definitely carries on as we work our way through this account, through the rest of Joseph's life, but on into Exodus. And I have a whole playlist, went through the whole book of Exodus. It's one of my favorite studies that we've ever done. I have a playlist for the book of Exodus, and you can go here, my website, Decoding the Deception. Let's see, I need to go to playlists. Playlists. And I have a whole playlist, the entirety of the book of Exodus, and I will put this in the description down below, this link in the description down below. Fascinating stuff. I think Exodus is one of the most interesting books of the Bible. But if you do not understand how Egyptian culture, how their religion, how their pantheon of gods, how their view of the afterlife, and how all that went, then you can't understand the Exodus correctly. You can't understand the crossing of the Red Sea correctly if you don't understand the way they looked at things. They took great care in how bodies were prepared for the afterlife, because if the body didn't survive, if it wasn't preserved and your things put there with you, you were lost and adrift without a body in the depths of Sheol, which they believed to be underwater, in the depths of Sheol for all eternity, misery. This guy gets hung on a tree. He doesn't get buried. He doesn't get embalmed. This is it's worse than hay. To this guy hearing this, to this baker, the worst part wasn't that the king was going to kill him and cutting off the head. That's part of it too. And hanging his body on a tree. That was the worst part, because the one's temporal. You get your head whacked off. As far as ways to go in the ancient world, getting your head cut off, it's not bad. Happens all at once and it's done. But they had ideas about the head not being with the body, but also that the body wasn't going to be there and available to you in afterlife. You were lost in misery for all eternity. And eternity is what matters, not the temporal. Now it came to pass on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of his chief butler and the chief baker among his servants, brought him out in front of everybody. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to him. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. That's just a theme in life. People move on. I mean, Joseph gave this guy this interpretation of the dream, put his mind at rest. It came true. But for whatever reason, he didn't remember Joseph, but forgot him. I imagine in that moment, he certainly thought about Joseph and the interpretation of the dream, but maybe he thought, well, I'll wait for a right moment. And then he gets busy being that important person again. And on it goes. Okay, now Pharaoh's dreams. And remember, this is another 2 years on after that. Does it right here. This timing. We've got these long periods of time. Don't you think Joseph knew that they got called before Pharaoh and then got elevated back to their positions? Yeah. Who do you think went and got them and washed them up and cleaned them up and gave them their clothes back and they marched up to see Pharaoh, and he heard the outcome of that? Nothing. Each day, waiting. Nothing. Put yourself in the text. Think about it like you're there, and it will give you insight. This is Joseph. He had to wait 2 years. This is Joseph. He had to wait 13 years from the time he was sold into slavery. I get down and out if I wait 3 days, if I think God isn't answering my dreams. Perspective. Look at the example of the great people of faith and learn. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after him. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed, it was a dream. Don't you wake up sometimes, it's like bad dream, and you went, oh, it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. When you go into the book of Exodus, remember all this stuff. These guys he calls on are the same ones he calls on when Moses comes before him. These are the lector priests. They are the viziers. Their advisors were not just military or secular or business advisors. These were spiritual positions. The way they looked at the world was altogether different than the way we look at the world and the way the leaders in this day look at this world. And yes, I know there's probably in many regards not that much difference when you look at the true spirituality of what goes on in this realm at this time. But anyway, Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. If you don't understand the Nile and its place in Egyptian life, Egyptian religion, Egyptian commerce, Egyptian agriculture, the river Nile was everything. Every year, there was an inundation, and that inundation came from the rainy season, from the rains down in Africa, blowing up, and it would carry all of this fertile silt and good stuff to make things grow. And when you think of, and I think I kept the map up, because what do we love here at Decoding the Deception? We love maps. Here is, zoom out a little bit. Hopefully, I don't know on this, if you can see, these are all the branches that come up of the Nile. The Nile comes up and all of this would flood. It would all be pretty much underwater, all the low places, and all of this good fertile stuff came up, and they had this beautiful, in a barren wasteland, they had this beautiful black soil that things would just grow. And in their view of things, Pharaoh, the king, whether he was called Pharaoh yet or not, Pharaoh was in charge of the inundation of the Nile, because the Nile gave life. They had songs about it, what we would call psalms. And he was the spiritual leader because they believed him to be Horus or Ra incarnate. He was in charge of it. Think of that in connection with Moses and the things that happened when God, through Moses, smacks down all the Egyptians' gods. He was in charge of that. And it was his number one job to give the most important thing to them was order. They called it Ma'at. Ma'at. Pharaoh was in charge of Ma'at, and the most important thing in Ma'at, and it's M-A''A''T, Ma'at, the most important thing in Ma'at was the flooding of the river, because without the flooding of the river, you had nothing. Everything would dry up, everything would die. So this dream is about the river. This dream is about food and sustenance. The changing of the guard with different dynasties in Egypt oftentimes came because he would get deposed, because apparently the gods had left that Pharaoh and he was no longer able to do his duty and provide order and the flooding of the Nile, and they would be out. So this dream connected with the river. Do you see it's a greater significance that it was by the river? Yeah, I think so. And it's the interpretation of this dream. We already know what it's going to be, right? Feast and then famine. That famine would have been the undoing of this Pharaoh. He would have lost his place. He would have lost his kingdom. They would have put someone else in because he couldn't do what he was supposed to do. He has the dream about the cows. And I've always wondered, even as a kid in Sunday school, I wondered, what in the dream did that look like when the skinny cows ate up the fat cows? You had to wonder what that looked like. It's kind of funny to think of. So he sent for the magicians, all those guys, the priests, to tell him what this meant. They were his servants. They were his advisors. And they couldn't tell him. Just like Nebuchadnezzar and the priests and the wise men and magicians that he sent for. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. You notice he doesn't say, you restored me to my office and you hanged him. He's like talking about it in the third person, right? Talking to Pharaoh was probably always, you were treading on thin ice. You didn't want to misstep. So talk about it in the third person. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. And they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Let's just stop right there. To us, like, yeah, he was in prison. They cleaned him up. You know, and I've got a picture. I don't know if I'm going to use this as the thumbnail for the video or not, but this is Joseph over here in prison talking to the that's probably the chief butler. I can tell you, the guy didn't look like this. The guy didn't look like this. Their ideas about cleanliness and how that related to order, ma'at, and you didn't go before Pharaoh if you weren't shaved, head and everything. That ties in with why, when it was the lice and tiny little bugs, that's when the priests in the Exodus account could no longer come before Pharaoh because they were ceremonially unclean. Joseph was ceremonially unclean. He had to be cleaned up and presented the way you had to be to come into the house of Pharaoh and speak to him. Always more to it. But understanding that then prepares us for looking at the Exodus and understanding it. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Listen to this. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I have nothing in my life that has any touch points of commonality with what Joseph is here experiencing. He is before the mightiest king of the world at that point in time. And rather than taking any credit for himself, he gives all glory to God, and he's going to do it repeatedly. He says this multiple times, both to the guys in the jail, and then also when he's dealing with Pharaoh. He never takes credit for it. It's astounding. It's astounding for a 30-year-old young man. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. That's interesting. An answer of peace. Joseph must have had some inclination of what God was doing. We don't know, but he says this thing about an answer of peace. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt." We don't have cows like that here. "And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows." This is a detail wasn't given before. When they had eaten them up, no one could have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Also, here's the point with that. Nothing was going to undo that famine. The famine was going to consume everything, and it was still going to be skinny and gaunt. "Also, I was in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them." East wind. The wind coming from that direction was always hot, and it was dry, and it tended to happen in times of drought. East wind, not good. "And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me." So now it's Joseph's turn. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one." God, again, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. God is the one doing these things. He's making it known to you. Now, therefore, Joseph's going to give some advice, and God is still moving him in this. "Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine." It's kind of interesting that the first dream that Joseph had, that dream, it was about grain. And now he's there in Egypt, and the Lord is using grain in plenty and the lack thereof to elevate Joseph. Very interesting. Though the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Now, this phrase does not mean he was talking about the God of the Bible. We don't know that. The term is Elohim. It's simply God. God. He could be talking about his own gods, and he thinks that's what's given Joseph this wisdom. But that doesn't matter. Pharaoh's take on things. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then it just elevated from being a servant in the dungeon to the head of all Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. I mean, he really elevated him, and he put him into the hierarchy. He gave him the wife, the daughter of the chief priest of all the land of Egypt. And let's just talk about this a little bit. What does Joseph do? We'll see that a little bit here in the text. What does Joseph do? He's got a job. He was given a job, and he carries it out. He's going to serve Pharaoh, just as he served Potiphar, just as he served the captain of the king's prison, the captain of his guard. He doesn't question. God has put him there. He will use his skills and abilities to the best of his ability in service to the one under whom God has placed him. And how could Joseph know? Now, you and I know where this story is going. We know that through that famine that is foretold, his brothers will come and guess what? Bow down before him. And then, in effect, his whole family, like the sun and the moon and the stars, will come and bow down before him. And through that, God will save the family of Israel, that will, in that incubator, that pressured cauldron of servitude in Egypt for 430 years, form the nation of Israel. Exodus is the birthing of the nation of Israel. And then the book of Joshua and the conquest is them getting their home in the promised land. Joseph couldn't know any of that. He was just being faithful. He was being faithful in the station in which God had placed him. And how do we look at him? How is he respected, admired, revered? If you've been listening to these Genesis videos, you know that this theologian thinks very highly of Joseph. He's an amazing individual, a faithful man, and he didn't whine, and he didn't complain. He was just faithful, and he didn't know how God was going to use that faithful service. Oh, that we could do the same, and we can. Just be faithful. How do I know where things are going to go? I'm getting to be a fairly old man, and I see how God has used different things that I thought were ill fortune, that I thought were setbacks, that I thought were the worst things that ever happened to me, and he has used it for good. Joseph, at the end of this book, is going to say to his brothers, you intended it for harm. Those things that they did to him, selling him into slavery. You intended it for harm, but God intended it for good. The stuff that's going on right now, the saving of many people. Humility of faith. We can't know the future. God doesn't tell us. He'll tell us the future. We just need to be faithful and believe that he uses us in our humble service in whatever capacity in the way he intends to. And what else could I ask for? What else could I want? What else could I desire? But at the end of all things of my life, that day will come to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. What it's all about. It's all I want to hear. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter the rest prepared for you by your Father. Well done. I know Joseph heard it. And so we labor here faithfully, not blindly, faithfully. There's a difference. I don't have to have all the answers. It is not my right to demand all the answers. That's arrogance. It is not humility. That is seeking to reign and rule, not desiring to serve. Jesus said of himself, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Service, that is what we are about. Verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And the Bible scholar, he's a Jewish Bible scholar, but real good insights on the Old Testament, and especially the book of Genesis and Exodus. How interesting that the shepherd boy who had the dream of sheaves of grain bowing down to him ends up being the Lord over all the agriculture of Egypt. It's kind of an interesting take on things. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph is not listed among the 12 tribes. He gets 2. He gets a double portion. It's Ephraim and Manasseh. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. Don't you think Pharaoh felt justified at that point in time? And yeah, he was Pharaoh. It wasn't like there weren't people who would question him, who wouldn't think, what's this guy doing? He's getting duped by this young Hebrew guy. He's made the guy all but God in the land of Egypt, and goodness gracious. 7 years, boom, spot on cue. Here it is. The famine comes. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over the face of all the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands. And I will say again, the Lord holds the king's heart in his hand, and like the rivers of water, he turns it wheresoever he will. Carry that on out to the governing of the nations. The famine that was on, it says it clearly, for good reason, repeatedly, was on all the land. God used it. God caused these things to happen to bring about what he intended to bring about. And none of this was about the prosperity of Egypt. He's going to raise Egypt up, and he says that in the book of Exodus, "I have raised you up so that I can lay you low." God's the one in charge. He's the one in charge, and he's about to bring Joseph's brothers there. We're going to continue to see this play out. We're going to see that Joseph, as the ruler in Egypt, he's fairly harsh. He's fairly harsh in how he deals with the Egyptians. We'll talk about that more at the time, but just right here, we see a picture, even in this setting. Government isn't about you. Remember that. Remember that. It's not about you and your well-being. And I believe this. Government, which literally is governing meant like mental, like mind, they rule to control you for their own good. And if you look at the world today, here in these United States, in Great Britain, in Australia, China, wherever you want to go, Russia, Ukraine, that's what goes on. What happened? Joseph taxed them. He took the excess grain and stored it away until there was so much he gave up trying to count it. How much is that? Because when there's a lot in the coffers, the people in power want to know how much is there. It was coming in so fast and in such abundance, they couldn't count it. And now that it's time to take care of the nation of Egypt and feed them that which was taxed away from them, he now sells to them. And I think one thing we can see here is Joseph had no love for the Egyptians, but he also was doing right by Pharaoh. What was his job? When he was in Potiphar's house, what was his job? To increase the prosperity of Potiphar. When he was in the prison, what was his job? To make the captain of the prison guard look good. Everything went really well when Joseph was in charge, and now it's over all the land of Egypt. His job is to serve Pharaoh. He is, in a huge way, building up Pharaoh, that nation. Joseph doesn't know that it's for the purpose of God laying it low to bring about the birth of his nation of Israel many centuries later. Just interesting when you look at the interplay here, the complexity of it. There is a lot going on. And I just got to do this. We'll go into it in depth next time. We're not going into chapter 42, but I just love this expression. And I've read it multiple times this week, and it makes me smile every time. When Jacob, we're back with Jacob now. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" Martin Luther had an expression that there are things in Scripture that some theologians look at like a cow looking at a new barn door. And if you're in the world of agriculture, and most people aren't today, but if you've spent time around livestock, It's like the cow. There's a new door, and the cow's looking at it like trying to figure out why it's there, what's it for, who put that door there. I just wonder, well, here, why do you look at one another? He's saying, why are you standing around looking at each other like you don't know what to do? I'm like, I don't know what we're going to do. What are we going to do? There's no food. What are we going to do? Go down. I heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there. It's kind of funny. I had to share that today, and we will continue with that chapter 42, and things get so interesting when those brothers go down before Joseph. Fascinating stuff. But I hope you enjoy this. I hope you enjoy going deeper into the setting, the significance of things that we could pass by and not think through. And all this stuff is important because the more we understand, you notice that when we point these things out and we go, oh yeah, that's why that's significant. It makes the message of what God is bringing about and how he's working things all the more. It brings his power, his might, and his grace, because that's the most important thing, is grace to the surface, that we can understand it all the more. I'm going to ask you, please do this. Hit like. I need to say it at the beginning, but I'm always so anxious to get started. Hit like, subscribe, leave a comment. Those things help promote this word out to others. The algorithm likes that. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.